Second seminar in our Infusion Seminar Series. So our speaker today is Sheldon Fernandez. So Sheldon, he graduated in 2001 from computer engineering here at the University of Waterloo. So he currently serves as the Vice President of Engineering at Infusion, with a special emphasis on developing reusable solutions and intellectual property within the organization. So his talk today will be on the role of technology in preventing mass atrocities. So let's welcome Sheldon here today. Okay.
Okay, guys, so the first thing I have to do is congratulate you for attending this class, although they take attendance, right? So that's why you're here. When I was in school, I had not a disdain for attending class. I think I probably had the worst attendance record out of anybody in the history of the engineering faculty. I'd come to the first day of class, the midterm review, the midterm, the final review, and the final exam. I don't know what I'm trying to say, Adam, other than, like, congratulations on not being me.
Do the opposite.
Do the opposite. So normally, I give a little more context on what we're talking about and so forth. So we have 50 minutes, and I'm going to try to cover some hopefully interesting material for you guys in that time. What do I want to say? I hope that this material will be a little bit outside the realm of what you have been studying for the past term, and it'll get you thinking about the power that your technical skills will give you long after you leave these walls. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about the role of technology in preventing mass atrocity crimes, which is a very heady and heavy topic. I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework on the concept of genocide. What is it? Why does it exist? How did it come to exist? We're going to then widen the discussion from genocide to mass atrocity crimes, and they are different. So we're going to look at things like war crimes and crimes against humanity and so forth. And then we're going to look at some case studies throughout history, and we're going to look at the role that technology played in either propagating those scenarios or mitigating them. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have an appreciation for how technology can be a really powerful tool for doing a lot of good in this world and also doing a lot of bad. Okay, so let's start off, and let's talk about, first of all, genocide. Now, I know many of you intuitively know what genocide is. It is the intent to systematically eliminate a group of people from either a particular land area or off the planet altogether. And probably the most poignant example we have of the genocide occurring would be World War II, and of course the crimes that were committed by the Nazi regime against the Jewish people. Now, what may actually surprise you is that the idea of genocide being wrong, the idea of it being a moral negative, is actually, believe it or not, a relatively young concept in the history of humanity. It's quite amazing. If you look at the history of our species, it was only during the Enlightenment era, when we had the idea of individual rights kind of be crystallized into the human consciousness, that the idea of genocide being wrong was, really a central concept of killing people. Before then, genocide was seen simply as the cost of doing business. So when one warring faction would conquer another, generally speaking, one of three things would happen. Either they would kind of consume those people within their own, population and amalgamate them and strip them of their religious traditions and their culture, or they would allow them to exist as second-class citizens within their own cultures, but nevertheless they'd have to pay a tax for having different religious beliefs and so forth. Or the third one was genocide. They'd simply eliminate them systematically from the population, and that would just be the cost of losing a war, let's say. And in fact, there's a lot of peoples that we know about today, and we only understand them, we only know about them from writings, because they were destroyed by other individuals. That said, the idea of genocide, the term genocide itself, comes from the Nuremberg Trials. Does anybody know what the Nuremberg Trials were? Yeah. Correct. Yeah, the Nuremberg Trials was when the Nazi leadership was put on trial after World War II for the crimes that were committed during that time against Jewish people, against, literally everybody. And it was a Jewish juror who, when he saw the scale of what had been done during World War II, when he looked at the terror and the systematic elimination of an entire race of people, 6 million out of 18 million Jews were killed during World War II, he decided that we needed a term in the English language to represent the apex, to represent the worst that humanity could levy against itself. And he termed that genocide. And the term genocide took on a formal definition in legal terms, okay, that you see up here on the screen. So genocide, as you can see, there's a genocide convention in 1948, and the term says it is an act that is committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And you can see some qualifiers up here. And the concept of genocide has a real kind of force in the international community because people are tried for genocide and mass atrocity crimes in the International Criminal Court. It's quite amazing. Sometimes 30 or 40 years after crimes have been committed, you have people on trial for those crimes. So for example, the Pol Pot regime in the 70s in Cambodia, there are people who are 80 and 90 right now that are on trial for what happened, in the 1970s. Now that said, looking at the definition of genocide that you see up here, can you see any problems or ambiguities with this terminology that would make it problematic in a legal context? So looking at this definition up here, any problems with what the definition currently says? So it doesn't quantify the amount of people, very good, right? So what does in whole or part mean? 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, right? So that's one problem. Anything else? Are there any groups that are not defined here? It says national, it says ethnic. Anything else that might be problematic? Okay, what about things like political, sexual orientation? Right, there's groups that are not a part of this definition at all. And so the ambiguity around the definition of genocide has been a real problem to get countries to intervene when genocide is occurring. Okay, I'm going to play for you one of the most infamous exchanges that occurred during the Clinton administration in 1994. And so at this point in 1994, we're going to talk about Rwanda as our first case study. Everybody in the international community knew that what was happening in Rwanda was in fact genocide. The State Department in the US knew, the UN knew, Amnesty International knew. And I'm going to play for you a clip between a Clinton spokesperson for the government and a Reuters news journalist. Okay, and just watch the ambiguity and the challenges that the definition of genocide results in.
Does the State Department have a view as to whether or not what is happening could be genocide?
We have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred.
How many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?
Alan, that's just not a question that I'm in a position to answer.
Okay, so consider the verbal exchange there. The spokesperson is asked, what is happening in Rwanda? And she said, acts of genocide are occurring in Rwanda. And then the reporter follows up and says, well, how many acts of genocide does it take to make a genocide? And she evades the question. She talks around it. So why do you think there was this circular language going on in that conversation, or to use a fancy word in English, circumlocution? Why wouldn't the spokesperson simply say, yes, what is happening in Rwanda is in fact genocide? Why this roundabout language? Yeah.
Avoid responsibility of it.
What's that?
Avoid responsibility.
Avoid responsibility of it. What do you mean?
So if they say it is an act of genocide and other countries say don't see it as that, then come with them, and if they do the opposite, then the opposite effect might happen.
So who is compelled to act then if we say it's genocide in this case? The U.S. Does anybody know why? Why would the U.S. be compelled to act by labeling something genocide? Okay? You might learn this in one of your international development courses. The minute a country, okay, a Security Council country in the UN, terms something as genocide, there's machinery that goes into force that says that country must provide humanitarian support, diplomatic support, and failing that, military support to address the situation. And so what the Clinton administration did not want to do in this situation is to term it formally as genocide, because that would have compelled them to act. And this is one of the great shames of the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton himself, in recent interviews, has said, if there's one decision he could reverse during his entire presidency, it would have been to intervene in Rwanda, because the cost of doing so was relatively small, but the cost of not doing so and the actions that resulted were incredibly large and disastrous. Okay? So because of the problems around the definition of genocide, we in the international community have widened the discussion from genocide itself to something more broad called mass atrocity crimes. And there are 4 mass atrocity crimes when we talk about this in a proper context. So there's genocide, which we talked about. That's the worst of the worst, right? That is the indiscriminate killing of a particular group with the intent of just eradicating them off the planet. And the Holocaust is one. We'll talk about some others. There's crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity describe atrocities, torture, killings, but it describes things that are sometimes not necessarily killing in and of itself. So, for example, the apartheid situation in South Africa has often been considered a crime against humanity. If the concept of this, crimes against humanity existed hundreds of years ago, the concept of slavery in the United States is often considered a crime against humanity. Okay? If you look at the treatment of First Nations peoples in Australia and so forth, a lot have interpreted that as a crime against humanity. So that's the second one. The third one is war crimes. So war crimes are atrocity crimes that take place in the context of an armed struggle. And these can be things like killing civilians, shooting civilians, murdering civilians, using civilians as human targets or human shields. Okay, the use of child soldiers, which is a large problem in Africa. Another interesting definition of a war crime is holding people indefinitely without trial. Okay, can you think of anywhere in the world right now where that is occurring? Holding people indefinitely without trial. Yeah. Guantanamo Bay, right? That is considered by many to be a war crime, because you have people who have sat in Guantanamo Bay for 15 years since the war on terror began and have still not been given official notice for what they've been charged with. And finally, the last one is ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing is kind of like a catch-all for the others. Probably the best definition we have of ethnic cleansing today would be the treatment of minority Christians in certain parts of Africa. And so what you have there are scenarios where the government has basically relegated them to arid, dry areas of the land where there's not proper water filtration, where there's not proper basic resources for sustenance. And so they're not outrightly killing people, but they are setting up a scenario where these people cannot flourish and actually live. And so ethnic cleansing is kind of the last one. All right? Here you have a map of the world right now that shows mass atrocity crimes. And you can see with varying levels of alarm, right? We have those that are in yellow, which are, there's certain atrocities going on. Those in orange, which, are quite dangerous. And those in red, where mass atrocity crimes are prevalent and systematic. Yeah. Mainly because I had to put it on the map. And it's a lot worse in this part of the world. Now, some of these shouldn't surprise you. You can see a lot of the Middle East and a lot of Africa is red. Does anybody know there's a country in red right underneath, right next to India? North Korea is in red. We'll talk about that. But there's one next to India that you see next to Afghanistan as well that's in red. Does anybody know what country that is?
Pakistan.
Okay, so there's Pakistan, which is quite bad, and there's another one, which is known as Myanmar or Burma. Okay, and Myanmar or Burma is not a well-known scenario, not a well-known situation right now. It doesn't get a lot of press. But there, for the past 5 years, the Buddhist majority, okay, so blow your mind, the Buddhist majority have been persecuting and killing the local Muslim minority. And the occurrences there inspired this Time magazine cover in 2013, The Face of Buddhist Terror. Okay, what this should teach you, for those of you that know about Buddhism, or who will learn about Buddhism, what this really testifies to is our ability as people, as humanity, to pervert any religious or spiritual system. One of the challenges also with mass atrocity crimes is that it's very difficult to try people for these crimes because many countries harbor people who have committed crimes in other countries. And so here's an article about how difficult it is to charge the Senegalese president for what occurred in the Sudan and the Darfur about a decade ago because South Africa wouldn't cooperate with the ICC. Lest you think that Canada is blameless, okay? I mentioned First Nations people. The way we've treated our Aboriginals throughout history has often been considered, crime against humanity. And just last month, our Truth and Reconciliation Committee related their findings about, the treatment of Aboriginals throughout history. And you can see some really dark statistics there. So, no country is really blameless. Nevertheless, we are going to concentrate our efforts on Africa. And we are going to concentrate our case studies on Africa because, per the map I showed you, it is really in the most trouble right now. Yes, there are other parts of the world where horrible things are occurring, but as a holistic continent, Africa is under considerable challenge. And it's quite amazing when you consider that in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, only 3 African countries were proper democracies. And now we have varying levels of democratic systems throughout Africa, and it's been a real challenge to implement them successfully. So we're going to talk about a couple case studies, and we're going to look at the role that technology played in those case studies. So the first one we're going to talk about is Rwanda. And last time I gave this talk to your colleagues in the previous term, I embarrassed myself because I said, who remembers 1994? And then I discovered that most of you weren't even born then. I was 16. I was in high school. Just a little bit of brief history then, for those of you that are not familiar with Rwanda. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for about 400 years, there were 2 tribes, the Tutsis and the Hutus. They weren't always called that, but let's use that terminology for our presentation here. And the Tutsis were generally a little more athletic, entrepreneurial, they were business people, and the Hutus were farmers, agricultural, and really provincial in terms of their, how they wanted to live life, let's say. But they existed peacefully for about 400 years, and yes, there were minor tensions between them, but on the whole, they existed quite peacefully. After World War I, Europe started colonizing various parts of Africa, okay, as you'll learn. And the Belgians were given Rwanda to run as a colony. And so in the early 20th century, using outdated models of eugenics, which they learned from the Germans, they separated the Rwanda population into 90% Hutu and 10% Tutsi. And they basically tried to show that the pigmentation of skin and the angles of their noses and all that the Tutsi were of pure European ancestry or closer European ancestry and therefore superior. And so they allowed the Tutsi to run the country, the 10% minority, to kind of rule over the 90% majority under the threat of Belgian military force. And so you can imagine what kind of dynamic that created. In 1963, so after World War II, Europe realized that the colonialism experiment was not only wrong, but it had failed. And so in 1963, Rwanda gets independence. And the hierarchy in the country flips, right? So the 90% Hutu majority that has been so maligned for decades, all of a sudden is running the country now, and the 10% Tutsi, who were their superiors, with the Belgians' help and military force, are now marginalized. And there's tension, and for 30 years there's a lot of tension, and it culminates in the Rwanda genocide of 1994. Okay, when? From April 6th to July 16th of 1994, 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred in Rwanda. And I use the word massacred explicitly because this was not concentration camps or bullets or bombs. This was killing in the most crude and sadistic manner. Axes, machetes, really, really horrific stuff. During this period, 6 men, women, and children were murdered every minute for every day, and this level of killing efficiency was maintained for more than 3 months. Between 250,000 and 500,000 women were raped during this time, and of course the most shameful thing is that the international community did virtually nothing until after about 3 months into the genocide, Tutsi counter-forces organized, entered through the Congo, and stopped the genocide on their own. And so great was the international community's failure to intervene in Rwanda that the very word Rwanda is a synonym now for our inability to act or our unwillingness to act in the face of horrific evil. You often hear, not another Rwanda. What's happening in Sudan, we can't allow it to be another Rwanda. So Rwanda is really, our case study because it is, in terms of proximity, it's the worst that we have in recent memories. And here's some rather graphic footage of the product of the Rwanda genocide. Okay? So, one of the questions I hope you're asking yourself, one of the questions I asked myself when I first really delved into this material, is how is this possible? We all understand that people can kill one another out of rage, out of isolated incidents of anger, to use a poor term that the media will often leverage, sick people, mentally ill people. But how is it possible that one group in the population can just completely, systematically, and with indiscriminate cruelty, absolutely wipe out, or almost wipe out, another segment of the population? So I'm going to read for you two quotes that gets us to this truth, hopefully. And the first one is, "The Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, it began with words. Genocide is never a happenstance or spontaneous uprising. Rather, it is a massive planned undertaking that requires a large number of active participants and the tacit approval of thousands of more who must be conditioned to play their roles." Okay? In other words, guys, genocide and mass atrocity crimes begin with hateful speech, with hateful thoughts, and an effective means of broadcasting and propagating that hateful speech and those hateful thoughts. And so let's look at how this was done in the case of Rwanda. Now, there are genocide scholars, believe it or not. There are people who dedicate their lives to studying these extremities of the human condition to try to understand it. And they have discovered two things when they look at the history of genocides throughout history. So not just Rwanda, but the Sudan, North Korea, the Armenian genocide, and so forth. The first thing you need to do, okay, is to describe your victim as vermin. So one scholar wrote, "How is it possible for people to kill other people on such a massive scale? The answer seems to be that it is not possible, at least not as long as the potential victims are perceived as people. The victims must not only be considered not equals, but also clearly defined as something fully less than human." So you need to convince the mass population that the people that you are trying to get them to kill is not human on some level. And again, if you look at the history of genocides throughout history, the World War II, very early on, the Nazi leadership was convincing the German people that Jews were somehow substandard and not fully human. So that's the first technique. The second technique is something called accusation in a mirror. And this is to convince the majority at large that if they do not act, that if they do not kill this targeted group, that they in turn will be killed. Right? So if you don't kill Jews, said the Nazi leadership, they are plotting and they are looking to take over Germany, so you must act. So think about what these two concepts do in tandem, right? Dehumanization, the first technique, makes genocide seem acceptable. Because you're telling people they're not human, it makes it seem acceptable. The second technique, accusation in a mirror, goes further by not only making it seem acceptable, but by making it seem necessary. And if we look at the history of the Rwanda genocide, very early on the dehumanization began in the popular media. So the Tutsi was described as cockroaches, as fully less than human. There was vicious gender propaganda against female Tutsis, and it started very early. And then accusation in a mirror, again, remember, it tries to convince the Hutus that the Tutsis are in fact trying to kill them. And so here's a very small clip that demonstrates that.
The propaganda at the radio station, that the Tutsis were a threat, they were coming back to take back our land, take away everything we have.
Okay, now let's talk about technology here. So in Africa in 1994, they didn't have internet, they didn't have TV even. If you guys don't remember this, but in 1994 the internet was in its infancy. We used dial-up modems and Netscape, not even Netscape, like other browsers. But the radio was the popular communication mechanism in Rwanda in 1994. And so the RTLM radio station in Rwanda, basically, and people at the radio station were put on trial for war crimes, propagated all this notion that Tutsis were going to come and attack the Hutus. And they convinced a large portion of the Hutus that they had to act. In fact, there was an incredible study done where they looked at villages that received the signal versus villages that didn't, and those that received the signal killed with higher levels of efficiency. Okay? Here's an interesting thing, and it's an embarrassing aside, is that both the United States and France possessed radio jamming equipment on the ground, but refused to use it. Now, if you're wondering why that's the case, first of all, hindsight is always 20/20. I don't think anybody knew at that time, in the early spring of 1994, that this was going to blossom into a genocide. But what you'll discover, and this exists even today, is that there's a real tension between our principles of free speech, of democratic right, and the realities of conflict zones on the ground. And the question that the international community always grapples with is, to what extent do we go into a country that is in conflict and try to remedy the situation? Or to what extent do we say, we have to let them self-determine their own history? Right? Because we, in North America, are a byproduct of civil wars and disputes in the past, and that kind of settled, who won, who lost, and who we are as a people. So that's what the international community grapples with. Now, the important point to take away from Rwanda is that communication and a way of propagating this hateful speech and these hateful thoughts is key in these conflict situations. In Rwanda, it was the radio, right? What would it be in most of these countries today? Wouldn't be the radio, wouldn't be TV, probably not TV, although maybe, what would it be? Internet. What do you mean? Internet, what specifically? Social media, exactly. Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. The last thing I want to mention before I get off the topic of Rwanda. Joseph Stalin, who was the infamous Russian president, dictator, whatever you want to say, he once said that one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. What did he mean by that? Yeah.
Significant, I suppose, to 1 million people die. You just see it as, you kind of lose all emotion to it.
Yeah. When you hear about things in the abstract, thousands of people dying, unless you know the personal history and story of those people, it doesn't hit you in the same way. But when you know one person who dies, right, and you see their history, and you see pictures of them as a baby, and you see their mother or father on TV talking about what a wonderful person they were, you even knew them, it hits you in a very deep emotional way. This story is one of the best stories I've read. It was in the Toronto Star maybe 5 years ago. It's called The Father and the Daughter We Let Down. And it is about the only video that we have that captured an actual killing of the Rwanda genocide. I'm going to show you in a second and warn you it's a little bit graphic, so this kind of thing is, violent, so you don't watch. But basically, it is about this journalist's attempt to identify the people on this film that were killed. And he eventually went to Kigali years after the fact and actually found and identified these two people and wrote their narrative. And so this is the video. And this was caught by a Reuters journalist who very quickly shot this, ferried it out of the country, and that night it appeared on German television and CNN. And it's the only picture we have of what happened in the Rwanda genocide. And he found them, and he found their pictures, and he talked to their, the wife of the father and the mother of the daughter who were killed. And he said, it's the father and the daughter we let down. And he basically personalized the struggle. And he said, if you multiply this tragedy by 1 million, that is the tragedy that is Rwanda. Okay? All right. Let's move on. We're going to talk about the Kenyan election of 2008. Okay, a brief history of the Kenyan election of 2008. There was a presidential election in Kenya in 2007 between the challenger Odinga and the incumbent Kibaki. Towards the end of the year, leading by over 1 million votes, Odinga declares victory. Miraculously, when the outstanding vote comes in the day after, the incumbent pulls ahead. And word spreads throughout the country that the presidential vote has been rigged. Okay? And there's violence that erupts in Kenya after the time. And at the end of the total casualties were about 1,300 people dead, about 600,000 people displaced. And finally, in March, under intense international pressure, the two candidates agreed to a power-sharing agreement, and there's generally peace in Kenya after that. Okay? So, let's take a look at social media in the context of the Kenyan election. First of all, in Kenya in 2008, people did not have laptop computers the way you guys do. They did not have smartphones. They did have regular phones, however, with SMS and text. It's quite amazing. I was in Kenya a couple months after this election, and I was in one of the poorest slums just outside Nairobi. And people are living in metal shacks, but they have phones that they pay for in kind of a micro-pay kind of way. And so there's SMS. And during this time, after the Kenyan election, they receive hateful texts from various tribal groups telling them that they have to engage in violence. Right? So it's sort of like the radio. They're getting this hateful speech and these hateful thoughts. The difference, however, is that unlike the radio, which was broadcast in one direction, other parties could intervene here. And so in the wake of the Kenyan election of 2008, Safaricom, which was the largest telecommunications provider in Kenya, approached the Kenyan government about offsetting this hateful speech and so forth with calls for calm. So it allowed some intervention. It allowed another voice into the narrative. At the same time, a group of very tech-savvy Kenyans created an online campaign called Ushahidi, which is Swahili for peace. And it's basically a mashup of like Google Maps and Twitter and these various satellite technologies that allowed Kenyans to document the violence that was happening in the country. And so it gave them some appreciation for what was happening in the country, and it also disputed the narrative that the government in Kenya was trying to propagate to the entire community. The influence of bloggers was also quite substantial in Kenya in 2008. Now you may wonder, well, if they have SMS phones, how is blogging so substantial? Okay, what happened was a lot of people converted the bloggers' testimonies into SMS text messages, which went out to the rest of the country. And so this allowed actors, this allowed people who were on the ground to dispute this nice, pretty picture that the Kenyan government was trying to present to people. Right? And it also leads to a very interesting point, and that is, in Rwanda in 1994, you had millions of Tutsis and moderate Hutus who could do nothing but wait for death or try to evade death. That's all they could do in that situation. This is different now, because when people have technology at their disposal, when they can speak, they can at least testify to what they are seeing. And so, in the words of Stalin, what these people did in Kenya in 2008 was they put a face to the statistics. They were able to show real pictures of the unrest that was happening in Kenya, and that galvanized the international community. Okay, and in fact, the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice at the time, flew into Kenya during this conflict, and in very stern terms, because of the international community's awareness that was raised partly because of these efforts, told Kenya that it had to get its act together or the United States would intervene. And within weeks of that meeting, the two incumbents agreed to a power-sharing agreement, and the violence in Kenya subsided. When I was in Kenya during this time, one of the individuals I was there with was from Rwanda. He was a survivor of the Rwanda genocide. And he was telling me, you know, Sheldon, for the first couple months in Kenya, it felt like the first couple months in Rwanda. Like it was simmering. You got a sense we were hitting this critical point where things might explode. And had these leaders not intervened, it very well could have turned into what Rwanda was in 1994. Okay, so you can see the effect of social media in this situation, which is it now gives the marginalized, at the very least, a voice for testifying what is happening on the ground. Okay? All right, our next case study is the Syrian Revolution, or what's happening in Syria. Okay, and a quick chronology for those of you who are not familiar with Syria. So the Arab Spring, you may have heard a lot about this in 2011, really galvanized large parts of the Middle East and the Arab community, and the call for democratic rights in various countries. One of those countries was Syria. And so Syrians take to the streets in 2011 and demand from their leader Assad democratic rights, constitutional reform, and so forth. He responds with military force. He says, I'm not going to buy this. I'm your leader. I've been a dictator for however long I've been. A dictator might be a strong word. I've been your leader, your despot, whatever. He responds with military force, and he's condemned for it. And as a result, there are various groups within Syria that form a kind of a counterforce, the rebels, and these two start to fight, right? You may have heard in 2012, the President of the United States, Obama, basically said that if it could be demonstrated that Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people, that he would intervene. And he did. The United States, depending on who you ask, did intervene to some extent, but not enough, according to some. And we have generally chaos in Syria and the Middle East right now. Right? A lot of what you will read about ISIS and ISIS's kind of terror throughout the Middle East is a byproduct of not having a cohesive plan in Syria. And they control large parts of Syria right now. Okay? Let's talk, though, about the role of technology in Syria. So, when this occurred in 2012, Syria banned foreign journalists from the country because they didn't want people reporting a narrative that was different from what the government was trying to say, which was everything's under control, we're not using weapons against our own people, and so forth. So as a result, regular Syrians took it upon themselves to document what was happening in the country. And so they went to YouTube, they went to other sites to really show what was happening, and within hours of Assad using chemical weapons on his own people in a certain part of Damascus, this site went up, which actually showed sickening footage of children, women, civilians, and the effects of chemical weapons. And that galvanized the international community to a large extent. Now, I want to point out here the importance of technology in this situation, right? And the different people who rely on technology in this context. So first of all, the government, the regime need it for their own logistical purposes and to kind of articulate their version of the narrative and what's happening. Their opponents, the rebels, need it as well for their own logistical support and to dispute the version being put out by the government. But here's the most important part. Regular Syrians on the ground need access to the internet now for basic information pertaining to health and safety, for pertaining to access to water, food, first aid, intelligence on the next target on Assad's list. And, as a result now, access to, digital information is as important in Syria as access to real, quantifiable first aid and so forth. So information is power. I remember maybe a year ago, you guys might remember this, horrible floods in Toronto. And I was at home with my wife in downtown Toronto, and our power cut off. And then my laptop died. And my phone was on like 15% battery. And I remember thinking, what if my phone goes out now? I don't have any connection to the outside world. Who would I call? Who would I talk to about, what streets were open in Toronto, and where can I get food, and so forth? And I'm in Toronto. I'm in a metropolitan, cosmopolitan city. Imagine a Syrian in the throes of a civil war and the extent to which they need information. So as a result, in the Middle East, in Syria, the conflict has taken on a digital dimension that we haven't seen before. Okay? And what you have now in Syria is cyber warfare going on. You have a level of cyber, tit for tat between Assad and his opponents to try to reduce access to the internet. There is a group called the Syrian Electronic Army, which is run by Assad's brother, according to most, that has used various deep digital techniques to try to thwart people's access to the internet, okay? And they are using something called deep packet inspection. So a little technical stuff for you guys that are technical. Does anybody know what deep packet inspection is? Yeah? Who said yeah? What is it?
They look at the entire packet. They look at everything inside.
Okay, so they look at the entire packet as opposed to what? What's the opposite of deep packet inspection? Just looking at the destination, shallow packet inspection, exactly. Right, so deep packet inspection, normally when you have bits of information that fly over the internet, we just look at the address and we send them to where they're going, that's it. But deep packet inspection actually takes a look at the contents of a packet, and based on that, we'll do something appropriate with them. Now here's the thing, deep packet inspection is used for good things today. Network providers often use it. They know if you're having a Skype conversation that's in real time, so they should send that with higher priority than if you're doing a BitTorrent download, right? Where you can wait, hopefully, at least a little bit. But the problem is that DPI can also be used very nefariously or negatively. And so what you have with the Assad regime is they are using deep packet inspection to stop citizens and rebels from communicating, okay? Does anybody know, how would you defeat deep packet inspection? You guys are technical. Let's say you were hired by somebody in Syria to get around DPI. Maybe that's your next co-op job. What would you guys do? How would you get around it? Sorry?
Use port.
Use a port? Okay, what's that?
The onion router.
What?
The onion router.
Okay, so there's routers, there's proxies, and then the government gets smart and they start recognizing those patterns, right? Because DPI is also based on statistical analysis of data. The real answer is you've got to write low-level networking code. You got to write stuff that randomizes and so forth. And there's just a war going on between these two factions. They fix it, then they write something different, and it goes back and forth. There's intelligence to suggest that on both sides you have various assistance from intelligence agencies throughout the world. CIA on one side, Russia or North Korea or China on the other. And so you really see this being played out in Syria, which is fascinating. Okay? So the important point to keep in mind is that with Syria, what I want you to kind of get from this is you can see the evolution of how important technology is. In Rwanda, it was the radio. We really couldn't do anything other than watch the situation. In Kenya in 2008, people were using SMS, but now you see a large part of humanitarian work, diplomatic work, philanthropic work has to rely on these type of skills. Okay? All right. The last scenario we are going to look at is North Korea, so something outside Africa. Now, first of all, a brief history of North Korea, very, very quick. In the aftermath of World War II, after Japan is defeated by the Allies, they, of course, control Korea, so now Korea becomes the responsibility of the Allies. And Russia and the United States have to decide how to split this country up. And this is a true story. Two low-level officers in the West Wing, or maybe the East Wing of the United States, are told, look, we're too busy restructuring Europe. You guys figure out how to divide Korea. And so they can't even find a map of Korea. So they go to an old National Geographic Atlas. They finally get one out. They finally locate a map of North Korea. And as a convenient way of dividing the country, they draw a line across the 38th parallel. And they don't realize that in so doing, they've put 2/3 of the country in South Korea, and they've given it most of the fertile land and the good land for farming. And they've put 1/3 of the country in the mountainous area of North Korea now, which is not as economically prosperous. And so they've divided that country that way. And there's been a lot of history of Korea, right? If you look at the Korean War of 1953, they essentially fought for 3 years to try to, claim ownership of the country and ended up exactly where they started. North Korea is significant for us today because it is one of the worst offenders of human rights in the world. It has been described by some as one very large concentration camp where there is routine torture, prison, inhumane treatment, enforced disappearances, and so forth. You cannot understand North Korea without understanding the family dictatorship of the Kims. So you have Kim Il-sung, who ran the country when it was first formed, his son Kim Jong-il, and now his son, Kim Jong-un. And the regime propagates this myth that these are demigods. Like literally, they've written the son of love, superior to Christ in love, superior to Buddha in benevolence, superior to Confucius in virtue, and superior to Muhammad in justice. And this personality cult rules North Korea. And you can see some pictures of North Korea that depict how wonderful their leaders are. Okay, and how beautiful it is. Of course, the reality is very different. North Korea has often been described as the impossible state. It is fair to say that Kim Il-sung managed to create a society that was arguably the closest approximation to an Orwellian nightmare in world history, and then managed to maintain the society for 30 years. Okay, now how does North Korea accomplish this? It is through a unique, pervasive, and systematic control of its population under the threat of terror and imprisonment like we've never seen. There is something, called the family responsibility concept, meaning if you were found in North Korea for violating the regime's rules, and this could be something as simple as singing a South Korean pop song, criticizing the regime in any way, every family in North Korea must have a picture of the Kims in their house, and if the police come by and there's a speck of dust on it, you could be dragged away. If you are found violating one of these crimes, you and your entire family, up to a certain number of degrees, sometimes your neighbors, your extended family, are immediately thrown inside political prison camps. And the life in these labor camps, has been described as the worst human construction since the dawn of civilization. Officially, the regime says people are there for political cleansing and edification. The grim reality is that there are beatings, torture, forced labor until death. And our understanding of these camps actually come from survivors who miraculously have survived the camps and then escaped from North Korea and have told us about them. There's two very powerful books, okay? The Aquariums of Pyongyang and Escape from Camp 14. And the next time you think life is tough, where you got too many exams, you didn't get that co-op job you wanted, pick up one of these books, read a couple pages, and you'll appreciate how lucky we all are, okay? We know of these camps, like I said, from survivors. I'm going to show you a very quick clip of one of the survivors' testimonies.
Defector An Myung-chol was a guard at number 22. He escaped through China and is one of the few guards to tell his story to the outside world.
When we were educated as guards, we were told not to think of the prisoners as humans. The moment you enter a North Korean prison camp, you're no longer a human being. If you think you're a human being, there's no way you can survive in the camps.
If a North Korean citizen simply complained to a friend about that month's rations, or did anything else that could be seen as questioning the regime, his entire extended family, children, parents, cousins, could end up in Camp 22 for life.
Okay, and here you have some aerial footage of the concentration camps as we know they exist today. So how does this relate to technology? Some of you heard about the Sony hack that occurred, maybe 6 months ago. Apparently, the North Korean intelligence hacked into Sony, took a bunch of data off their servers, and publicized it. The long and short of it is, all this back and forth really showed a lot of the technical capability of North Korea. And in fact, they are quite capable of technology. Now, here's something I very want to quickly quote to read you. A 2011 report by the regime stated that the happiest people live in China, with North Korea coming in second. And it's remarkable that a state that describes itself as a utopia would actually have China in first. How do we understand that? We understand that because technology now is starting to seep information into the country. They have access to cheap computers, electronics through China on the borders, and so people are beginning to learn that, in fact, there is a world outside North Korea that they never knew about. Many of them don't even know that America landed a man on the moon, that certain realities have taken place. Okay, and if you get a chance, I would recommend there's a computer scientist, a graduate student, he's American, who taught computer science in the DPRK, as it's formally known. And he basically showed that they are learning technologies, they are learning Linux and Unix, and they have sort of access to the internet. So many people feel that this regime will eventually be brought down from within. And one of the ways that may happen is access to technology. Okay, I might have like 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, let me wrap this up. How do we put this all together? Okay? I've given you some very, very heavy stuff, right? Somebody said, years ago, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Does anybody know who said that? Who said that? Okay, Martin Luther King said that. And you may be wondering, given the atrocities that I've shown you, given the worst of the worst, is this true? Okay? I'm going to read from you. I'm going to go quote if we don't have enough time. I'm going to read from you something that a genocide scholar wrote. Okay, we'll leave it there. Encounters with genocide survivors teach us that in the midst of utter darkness, those that have witnessed unspeakable horrors and suffered irredeemable losses, but who refuse to surrender their dignity and go on living, searching for answers, seeking justice, these are the most powerful proof of the resilience of the human spirit and the indomitable hope without which true civilization and progress would be extinguished. Okay, this is a friend of mine, the friend I was telling you about. His name is Marcel. He survived the Rwanda genocide, and he is now a priest, believe it or not. And he has dedicated his life to building the country up and so forth. So, to the extent that there are horrible things, the hope is that there are people, nevertheless, that rise out of that controversy and that evil and actually turn the situation around. The last thing I want to leave you with is that what technology is doing now for a lot of us and a lot of people in the international community, it is turning the statistics into tragedies. Because now when you hear that, somebody died in Syria, you don't read about it. You actually can see YouTube footage of the atrocity. you can see the effects of chemical weapons on children. And that has galvanized people in a way that we haven't seen before. Okay? So, as you guys finish your time here and work with technology and so forth, it can do wonderful things. It can do apps that allow you to order a meal quicker, and that's all wonderful stuff, but you can also really do some fascinating things in this realm, and never discount the power that technology has in these scenarios. Okay? So I will turn it over. Sure. So I work for a company called Infusion. I started it with 4 other grads when we finished school, and we just started this year something called Infusion Africa, which was a philanthropic initiative at my firm to take the engineering skill we have and to apply it to, the developing world and so forth. We're working with the Stephen Lewis Foundation, for example. They do a lot of work addressing something you guys may know is that AIDS and HIV actually knocked out an entire generation of adults in Africa in the 90s and 2000s. And so grandparents have been crushed with the crushing responsibility of taking care after children. So we're connected to the Stephen Lewis Foundation. We're developing apps for connecting grandmothers here with grandmothers in Africa. So there's some fascinating stuff that we're trying to do just to see how can we leverage technology to really make the world a better place. And if you're ever interested in it, just drop me a line and I'll tell you about some of those cool stuff.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.